Since 1999, the trio of Matt Bellamy, Chris Wolstenholme and Dominic Howard have been performing their own unique style of flamboyant operatic rock to the masses, painting pictures of new world orders and new worlds in space. Over the course of 5 albums, their music has evolved, reaching grander scales and offering mind-expanding theories for fans to ponder. While as a live act, they have progressed from playing a local battle of the bands to selling out multiple nights in stadia all across the world. This is Muse, and this is their story.
I'd say Muse are probably, one of the biggest bands in the world, both stylistically and musically. Whereas other bands seem ridiculously earthbound, Muse look at music on a galactic scale.
Muse are a band with 3 little men in the band, but they make a very big noise. It's a big, symphonic, epic, rock monster of a noise. It's like heavy metal, and yet at the same time you've got the voice of a little angel coming in and flying round amongst all this kind of epic pomposity.
I did see them being a bit more important than just being a rock and roll band. With Matt's amazing musical talent, it's really like he is the conductor and the orchestra all in one.
They're a really ridiculous band in many ways. They're the kind of band that shouldn't work. There's all these different ideas thrown into the pot, the kind of bombastic, kind of quite pompous ideas, huge guitars, lots of electronics, prog influences, glam influences, all these things chucked in. It should sound ridiculous, but it sounds fantastic.
Muse really are the most modern band, they're a band that will use not just guitar but all sorts of instruments and really make music like you'd never heard before.
Teignmouth, on the south coast of England, is a quiet seaside town not known for its musical pedigree. However, in 1994, it unwittingly spawned a band that have become so huge, there is debate amongst their fans as to whether the planet is big enough to contain their music. The 3 members of Muse were not originally from the area, but all moved there at an early age. And it was on the seafront in Teignmouth in 1993 where a teenage Matt Bellamy first encountered Dom Howard, and the seeds of Muse were sown.
Teignmouth is a very small, indistinct seaside town, very pretty, but I'm sure growing up there as a teenager you wouldn't have a huge amount of funds, not much there to do. There wasn't much there to do when Muse were growing up. They had a roller disco locally. They used to go walking up the cliffs with their friends and, girls that they might want to entertain. But there wasn't much there apart from the Den on the front of Teignmouth, which is a fairly big but fairly dull, large piece of grass, basically, which is where Matt Bellamy and Dom Howard met for the first time.
They were very different types, actually. Dom was kind of a long-haired, sort of jazz-loving indie rock kid. And Matt had kind of got in with the sports crowd, and he sort of had a sort of flat-top haircut and was wearing sort of tracksuits and was, a bit of a rough-looking type. But he was getting into playing guitar at the time, and so I think they were about sort of 14 or 15, and he sort of wandered over, introduced himself to Dom, who was drumming in a local rock band called Carnage Mayhem, and basically asked him if he could teach him a few more things on the guitar, because he was fascinated about getting better at it. And so they started playing together in Carnage Mayhem. Dom got him an audition for the band, and Matt got taken on, and basically between the 2 of them, they scared off everybody else that ever wanted to play with them, because all they wanted to do was play these massive, great prog, punk, scary noise things, and so they sort of basically became a 2-piece after a while. All of the rest of the musicians in town didn't want to play with them. Carnage Mayhem became a band called Gothic Plague, and Chris got sacked from the band that he was in because he was a fan of Status Quo, and Gothic Plague needed a bassist. So I think I think the first time Chris had ever played bass was something like 2 or 3 days before he was asked to join.
With the lineup of Gothic Plague established, the band set about creating their own sound and styles. Their influences came from various different genres, from classical to heavy metal, and it was all to have an impact on the eventual sound of Muse.
Matt was into hip-hop, which we wouldn't necessarily think now, but he was into hip-hop. He wore shell suits, he wore high-tech trainers, he was into Derek B, he was into kind of, some American stuff as well. But Dom was very different from him. He was into Nirvana, he had the grungy hair, he had what Matt referred to as new age trousers. They were as different kind of people as you could imagine, really. And soon enough, Matt wasn't wearing the trainers anymore, and he was getting into bands like Mega City 4 and the Senseless Things, and that's where their sound came from, really.
Matt's upbringing had sort of two major strands to it. I mean, it had the musical strand, which came from his dad being a member of the Tornadoes, who had one of the first transatlantic #1s with Telstar back in the early 60s.
It's funny when you listen to Telstar, because you could hear the sound of that record, which is incredibly futuristic for its time, very bizarre. Obviously produced by Joe Meek, who was really pushing music forward, looking at electronic sounds. It still sounds now in 2009 very weird. I think it's kind of a nice symmetry there. You listen to Muse's music, which itself is quite bombastic, quite, obviously electronic, and trying to almost be like have a futuristic sound about it. There is that tie there, and there's that kind of guitar sound that is, you could almost trace back to that. So you wonder whether he was influenced by him. I'm sure he was.
Matt kind of got a little bit of that genetically sent through to him, just because he was a great mimic of music. He would often hear theme tunes to TV shows and go to the piano and be able to sort of pick them out from memory. So there was always a lot of music around, and his dad would sort of introduce him to the likes of Robert Johnson, all sort of blues stuff, and some 70s rock things.
I got round on my mind. I got round on my mind. Hate to leave my baby, but you treat me so unkind.
Matt and Dom talked about their early days as being very much into kind of English or British indie or kind of alternative rock bands, really. Obviously, you get the sense that Matt has always had quite a wide music taste outside any kind of rock. He always liked classical music. He played the piano, he picked things up. He used to listen to older records. But I get the sense at that time they were more into the music that was going on around them. As they got older, their tastes broadened and developed. And there's always been a sense of adventure about what they're into.
And also, he had an unusual upbringing in the fact that his mother and both of his parents really were quite spiritual people, and they would often hold seances. I mean, they would play with Ouija boards a lot, which opened his eyes to lots of ideas about life beyond death and what you're actually connecting to when you go into spiritual realms.
Obviously they got together at a very young age, which not many bands do these days. Bands get together when they're a bit older, or they're put together by a Svengali, but Muse met when they were teenage boys and young teenage boys.
After playing a few early gigs around Teignmouth as Gothic Plague in 1994, Matt, Dom and Chris, still only in their mid-teens, decided to take part in a local Battle of the Bands competition, where they performed as Rocket Baby Doll. Despite their appearance being intended as a form of protest, the outcome proved to be pivotal in their career.
Well, the Battle of the Bands was it's gone down in legend, really, in Devon musical history, because they changed the name to Rocket Baby Doll like the night before the gig or something, and because Matt had seen some sort of Japanese anime program. They sort of went on stage, sort of done up like the Manics, all makeup all over their faces, and basically just tried to make as much noise and chaos as they possibly could. And they instigated a stage invasion, and they won the competition just because they were so crazy. So yeah, and I think that made them realise that even though they were just taking the piss, really, they could get a reaction.
For me, I think it was because the first gig we ever did was, as I said, was a battle of the bands, where we beat all these pub-type bands by just being aggressive and with a lot of attitude.
I think the main thing is just believing in yourself, believing in the music you play, and obviously enjoying it, really. That's the main thing that keeps you going.
However many people we played to, there was always one or two people who said that was like the best thing I've ever seen, and it's worth it just to hear those couple of people say that. Do you know what I mean?
Now renamed Muse, the three boys decided they should try and focus more attention on their music. Determined to get a breakthrough, they played several gigs locally, building up a strong set of early songs. While searching for studio time in late 1995, Muse crucially came to the attention of local studio owner and music impresario Dennis Smith, who had brought on successful bands such as Supergrass, and whose Sawmills studio had played host to UK acts such as Oasis and The Verve.
Dennis Smith was a kind of local hero, I get the sense, obviously down in Sawmills studio in Cornwall. And a friend of his had heard about Matt's piano playing, wanted to get him involved on a project.
Dennis Smith heard about that then, but Matt was way too young for him to get in touch. But I think he kind of kept his ear open, and a few years later, when Muse had done a little bit of touring around the local pub circuit, they put together a Muse demo, recorded largely by Matt's dad, and that got to Dennis Smith. He went to see them regularly for about 18 months before he decided that they'd become good enough for him to sort of mentor them a bit.
What I think is very interesting about his involvement is he obviously saw the potential in Muse, but wouldn't give them a bit of studio time, wouldn't give them the break that he could give them.
It was now 1997, and Smith took the fledgling band to his studios, where he set them up with engineer Paul Reeve, who helped them record their first EP, known as the Muse EP. Smith had felt that Muse were the perfect band to bring into his newly formed company, Taste Media, which he had established in 1996 with business partner and long-term music industry professional Safdar Jaffrey, which had the sole purpose of bringing on new acts.
Dennis had mentioned to me about these three kids he knew in his local area in Teignmouth, because Dennis was based down in Devon, although the studio was in Cornwall. And he played me some early demos, which I thought were very promising at the time. And I suggested that he put them in the studio and we'll just watch over them.
Dennis offered the band sort of free time whenever any bands weren't using Sawmills, and they could go in there and record demo songs there, on the requirement that were they to get big and huge, that eventually they would pay him back for the studio time. But eventually that sort of built into a full-on business relationship.
Obviously their sound was very challenging, and they always had a sort of an American twist to their sound, which was different to a lot of the Britpop bands around at the time. And at the time that we got involved with Muse, Britpop had sort of just peaked. So all the record companies were sort of throwing out guitar bands saying this was all over now.
There wasn't any prevailing trend. Obviously Britpop had come and gone, and all the Britpop bands were making either ridiculously over-the-top records like Oasis did with Be Here Now, or they were making records like Blur did, which are kind of almost like a come down from Britpop. Everybody was trying to work out what the next thing was going to be. Muse's early EPs almost reminds me of some bands that were not as well known, but kind of came around, almost inspired by, Radiohead's more, experimental stuff. But there were also bands like Strangelove and Sub-Circus, and bands that had this quite flamboyant rock sound about them.
What Muse were doing musically was, was definitely a lot more innovative, a lot more challenging, a lot more, they were pushing the boundaries a lot more than some other bands.
On May the 11th, 1998, Muse released their first of 2 EPs on Smith's indie label, Dangerous. The second EP, entitled The Muscle Museum EP, featured remixes of additional tracks from the band's first sessions with Paul Reeve, but was not released officially until January 1999. Both were carefully coordinated steps forward in a bid to land the band a UK recording contract, yet this was to prove a lot more difficult than first expected.
These EPs became the demos. There were other songs around as well. And Safta and Dennis, which formed a company called Taste Media, put the band out on some tours and put the demos around the record companies, which is kind of the procedure you do to kind of get a deal. You try and get the industry interested and create a bit of a buzz. And to be honest, no one replied. No one came to the gigs. No one from the record companies. No one did anything. There was no action at all.
We'd put out the second EP at the time, which was the Muscle Museum one, and we'd had some very good press on it. And in the city conference was around the corner, so we thought that would be a good platform to introduce them to the labels. And they did a very good show. There was a little bit of interest about them, and also that year that they played, they were one of the 3 bands that in the city picked out as being sort of the most promising ones. And then following that, following in the city, there was like a best of in the city that was being staged at the 100 Club, which was like a couple of weeks after that. And then Muse played on that. And I think we must have invited pretty much every record company bod in the UK to that show. But there was no follow-through. A lot of the executives said, well, we don't really get this. We don't think they're going to get radio play. We think it's going to be very difficult, So there were 1,001 excuses.
And so Safta said, well, blow this, I'm going to take it to America. And he had good American contacts with the record companies in America. And he got a great response.
There was CMJ coming up around the corner, which is the New York Music Conference, and that's normally in November. And I said to Dennis at the time, I said, look, we're really going to struggle here in the UK. So why don't we take them to America? So we managed to get them a slot at CMJ, and we flew them over, and we did a showcase there, and that show went down extremely well. There was one girl from Columbia Records there, Nancy Walker, who came up to me straight after the show saying, I thought they were absolutely amazing, would you consider flying them to LA to do a showcase for Columbia? And I said, of course.
Jeffrey and the band flew out to LA in November 1998, where a showcase had been arranged by Columbia Records on Santa Monica Pier at 11 a.m. so that producer Rick Rubin could attend. Rubin had worked with several big-name acts such as Metallica, the Beastie Boys and the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and now it was time for him to cast his eye on this unknown British band from Tinmouth.
She had something to confess to, but you don't have the time, so look the other way. You will wait until it's over to reveal what you'd never shown her. Too little, much too late.
So when we did the showcase, Rick Rubin turned up, and the showcase was great. It was a great success. He was pretty impressed, and he actually came up to me after the showcase and whispered in my ears. He said, "Hey man, you got the modern day Beatles there," and which I thought was a strange thing for him to say, taking that nobody was interested in the band up until this point. I thought, yeah, okay, well, I believe they are, but fantastic, you also think so. So he suggested, could we stay in town for a few more days, because we were due to fly back straight after that showcase. And of course, we're in Los Angeles in November, and of course it was pissing down with rain back in England. It was a no-brainer. Yeah, sure, we'll stay as long as you want.
They were packed up and ready to fly back, thinking they were going to be signed to Columbia within a few months. And they got a message through from a guy called Guy O'Seary from Maverick Records, literally minutes before they were about to leave for the airport, coming through to Safta Jaffrey, who And basically he said to him, he didn't know Muse were in town. He'd been keeping an eye on them for some time, and he totally loved them. And he said to them that even though they were there on Columbia's money, they had to stay for another couple of days to showcase for him. Otherwise, they'd get back to London and he'd have to fly them out again in 2 weeks' time. So, you know, they thought about it for a second and went, okay, and they booked a rehearsal studio for the next day.
And Guy Oseary turned up with Steve Jones from the Sex Pistols, and I recognised Steve straight away. And, you know, and they said, you know, play us a few songs. And so the band, I think they played Muscle Museum, and then they played Cave. And it was during Cave that Guy just stood up and said, that's it, that's enough, you guys are absolutely amazing. You know, I don't need to hear any more, you know, it's absolutely fantastic, and left. So at the time I thought maybe he wasn't interested, he just made his excuses, because I'd seen that so many times before with record companies. But true to his word, the next morning he called me back and he said, look, he said, you've got the best band in the world, you know, you guys are the reason that I got into the music industry. But he was very flattering over the phone. He said, you know, I want to sign you guys. He said, you know, here's the number of our attorney, put him in touch with your attorney and they'll figure out the details.
And that was it, and they were signed to Maverick within about 2 months. They signed on Christmas Eve.
Muse soon found that their deal in the United States was about to have a much bigger impact than first thought.
Well, I think that Maverick deal sealed the deal for them around the world as well. As soon as people, I mean, Maverick had big successes with like the Deftones and Alanis Morissette, and when it was Madonna's label, and there was only sort of 15 acts on the label, so it was a big deal that they would sign anything at all. And so once Muse got signed that quickly, and there was all this sort of fevered rush for them in America, suddenly England picked up interest again.
I'd been talking to a good friend of mine who was running Mushroom in Australia, called Michael Parisi. Now, Michael loved the band. He loved the tracks that I sent him. And Michael had kept asking me what was happening with Mushroom in the UK. And I told him Mushroom in the UK didn't really like it. They'd seen the band 2 or 3 times now. They really didn't get it. And so he said, look, I still want to sign it for Australia. So at the time, I was in LA at the time, talking to Maverick about, you know, the whole plan on how we were going to do things. And Corder Marshall, who was the MD of Mushroom in the UK, had just visited Mushroom in Australia and was travelling through LA and wanted to meet with me to tie up the Australian deal. So we met up at the Sky Bar at the Mondrian, and I remember this quite clearly because we were talking about the license for Australia. And he turned around to me and he said, what about the UK? And I said, well, you didn't want the UK. He said, well, I want it now. I said, well, okay. And I said, all right, well, if you want the UK, and I sort of scribbled some notes on a napkin that was nearby. And I said, well, if you want the UK, this is going to be your deal for the UK and Australia. And he said, well, that's very rich. And I said, well, Corder, if you want the UK, that's going to be the deal. So he signed the napkin, and that's how we ended up with Mushroom in the UK.
The contract with Maverick had not only enabled Jaffrey and Muse to strike deals in various territories worldwide, including the UK, but also funded the band's first album, Showbiz.
The great thing about doing the deal with Maverick was that the fund that we managed to negotiate from them, the advance fund, was to make the album the way, you know, I always thought it should be made. And I always had John Leckie in mind to make the album. And so the fund allowed us to do that.
John Leckie, obviously in the 90s, was the go-to producer ever since he produced the Stone Roses' first album. It was one of those albums that really formed this idea of Britpop. So to go to him, you know, was a good idea, because you can imagine them almost wanting to pick a certain person to kind of hone their sound and make a statement.
With Showbiz, some of the songs were already recorded because they'd recorded these 2 EPs. I guess they'd done about 8 songs on the EPs. And so what we did really is have a meeting and went through all the songs they'd already recorded and the existing songs that they'd kind of demoed, and chose what to reactivate from the EPs, from the originally recorded stuff, and what to redo, what to cut live again, you know. So we used Rack Studios in St John's Wood in London and re-recorded, I suppose, about 5, 6, 7, 8 songs, I think.
John had been very much part of, you know, the family, if you like, and he'd already made a good, strong, you know, relationship with Matt and the boys. And they talked about how they would, go ahead, and plan the recordings. So the whole recording process was very smooth, very little input from us. I mean, we basically just trusted them to make the record.
Showbiz was released in October 1999 and fused classical flavours with strong rock melodies. Yet the album also contained an underlying darkness that was present from the opening track, Sunburn.
Well, with Sunburn, it's a piano track, really, and I think Matt quite liked the idea of confusing the audience of thinking that Muse was a guitar band, and here was the first track on the album, and the first sort of minute or so of the record is just the piano.
Another corporate show, a guilty conscience grows. I'll feel a guilty conscience grows. I'll feel a guilty conscience grows.
That's where I think with that track, Matt was really finding his piano style, and I was always amazed at how he could play, because he'd sit for hours playing that part and just, kind of seeing how to play every note on the piano, starting at the lowest and going all the way up, and it's virtuosity, really.
He was into really classical music. He was into Berlioz quite heavily. These sort of doomy masses that I'm not really sure how he came across them, but that sort of led him down all sorts of orchestral and classical music directions.
The dark feel of that track with the piano was kind of what we kind of went for, really. And one of the tricks I used, I can remember, was I had what's called a throat mic, and it's actually used in a tank, it's a military microphone that you strap around your throat, and it just picks up the vibrations of your vocal cords. And it was all kind of battered, but it's from the war, and it was kind of khaki coloured, and I'd used this for vocals before. And when we were doing the piano, I thought, well, what happens if I just put that in the piano? And we actually just laid this microphone on the sounding board of the piano. And that gave it a kind of dirty, gritty sound, because we didn't want it to sound too classical or too clean or anything.
She burns like the sun. I can't look away. She'll burn our horizons. Make no
Every Muse album has started with a track that's slightly strange or slightly peaceful or quiet, or the kind of track that does mess with your expectations of a rock album a bit. It wasn't arrogance, it was just a sense of we're a rock band or we're a pop band, whatever they thought themselves. We can do this, we can make this sound really work, and that was a very attractive thing about it.
Looking back on it now, it does seem a little bit sort of subdued for Muse, even though at the time it was something that just really didn't fit very well with the prevailing musical stride. Everything in music was very sort of plodding and down low, and this was this massive, great sort of operatic noise rock thing.
Back then, the boys were in their early 20s. You'd imagine a first album to be a little rough around the edges, a little raw. There are tracks on that record that sound so confident. Tracks like Uno, which are just sound like they're prototypes for a Bond theme almost.
Nothing to me, 'cause you are nothing to me, and it means nothing to me that you breathe into me, 'cause you could have been number one if you only found the time, and you could have ruled the whole world if you had the chance. You
The likes of the sort of Spanish flamenco thing actually was inspired by trips that Matt took around Europe as a teenager. He went around sort of Spain and saw a lot of these flamenco artists playing. Was really inspired by that, and I think that came through on Uno.
Matt was always very much a show-off person with his playing, and his singing. So he'd often, do crazy things with his guitar and make crazy noises and this kind of thing. So, I just encouraged that. Really, I encouraged him to do. Do that kind of thing.
Having worked with John all those years, I just knew that that he would make the record that we would believe in, the sort of record that the band would need to make. And also the band, by that stage had played so many shows anyway that John's job really in many ways was really to try and stretch them as much as he could, but we knew they were already a very tight band.
In the studio, we'd often listen to other records, other CDs, and I'm a kind of blues fan. I'm kind of into Beefheart, Tom Waits, and Love, Forever Changes, and things like that, because that's my generation kind of thing. So yeah, I did introduce. We would play Tom Waits, and of course Matt was just astounded with that voice, because it's so different to his voice, and he couldn't believe that someone could sing like that, and it could actually be put on a record, So he was quite, and Captain Beefheart as well. I mean, he was very into, not just the voice, but Trout Mask Replica, the crazy sort of rhythms and things. So I introduced him to that.
Too much for my mirror, she almost makes me lose it. Way she abused it, make me never wanna use it. Well, meet your heart and mind your soul. Oh, Chicago, she's the woman to make a young man a bomb. Where she howled like the wind, made my heart grow cold. Made me long for that little red farm. She made things fly, she made things roll. She got me way over here and I'm hungry and cold.
I remember he came up to me once and said, "Jimi Hendrix, what should I be listening to? I've heard of this guy, Jimi Hendrix. He's meant to be a good guitarist, isn't he?" I'm like, yeah. And, what track should I be listening to? What should I be getting from him? So he was quite naive about, his taste in music and what he'd heard before.
While single releases Sunburn and Uno, along with Muscle Museum and Cave, promoted Muse's style of flamboyant rock, there was also room for more thoughtful and tender themes, as demonstrated in the track Unintended, that was released in May 2000.
Unintended sounds very different to the other tracks, obviously, because it's acoustic, because it has that almost a kind of softness about it. It sounds very young, it sounds very tender, which are qualities that we wouldn't necessarily relate to Muse today, although there's always been elements on every one of their albums that shows that they have this different side to them. You can see in that track the roots of everything up to almost the symphony off the new record. There's that sensitivity that they obviously want to express, as well as their bombastic nature. And it's a very early example of that. I think it's a very sweet song.
I think lyrically, actually, they were a little bit naive, just because, as we've seen over the albums that came afterwards, there was an awful lot of mental gymnastics going on in these records. There's so many topics and conspiracy theories and ideas flying around in these records that to look back at showbiz now, it is all quite personal, and it's you've got to remember that album, they'd only just cut out all of the songs that they'd written about Teignmouth and about not liking it and about wanting to get out of their hometown. these were the first songs they were writing about seeing the world a bit and you know, getting long-term relationships. I mean, Matt had been in a relationship with the girl since he was 16 at this point, and so there was a lot about that. I think it was quite introverted lyrically. Although you've got things like Unintended, this really sort of really moving little ballad about, you know, the troubles of relationship, and so stuff like that comes out, and it's really quite heartening and touching. But I think at that point it was much more about the music and much more about where they were going sonically than the lyrics, which I think were maybe a bit teenage.
They were extremely mature for their age, to be honest. I mean, they were, what, 17, 18 at the time. We were working with them. You know, it didn't really feel that way. You know, they were very mature as musicians, very mature as people, and, you know, they weren't very difficult to work with. You know, they believed in our plan. They believed in, you know, Dennis and my sort of work ethic.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I do this is to express how I feel. You know what I mean? It's music's what I've chosen. I could have been doing something else maybe. You know what I mean? But I think I don't think I've always wanted to communicate with other people how I feel about stuff.
I thought the album was fantastic. You know, obviously we'd been popping in and out of the studio while they were making it. But, you know, I think it was the debut album they needed to make. You know, I thought it was fantastic. I think it sort of showcased where the band were at the time of their career. I think John had stretched them as much as he could. There was, you know, it had the experimental in there. It had the edge. It had a pop sensibility. And, you know, I felt that it was an album that was delivered that would last the test of time, you know. We really felt that at the time. We felt very, very confident that we'd made the record. And the great pleasure was that when we delivered it to Maverick, they loved it.
Showbiz was met with a warm reception and a respectable chart positioning for a debut album at number 29. However, in some quarters, the operatic and somewhat bombastic nature of Muse's music pushed some critics away, while others chose to draw heavy comparisons to another UK act, Radiohead, not only due to their sound and style, but also because of John Leckie's connection with the band.
I produced the Bends Radiohead, you know, it was probably about 5 years before I met Muse, so, you know, it was quite a lengthy period. And during that time, you know, I'd had lots of offers to work with a lot of bands, you know, American bands particularly, who wanted to be Radiohead kind of thing. And I'd turn them down. And to be honest, Muse, I didn't really think they were like Radiohead influenced, you know. They were more into Metallica than I think Radiohead.
Can't get the stink out. He's been hanging around for days. Comes like a comet, suck at you but not your friends. And then he'll get to you and teach you how to be a holy. Can you do it to yourself?
I think the Radiohead comparisons at the time, to be honest with you, was lazy journalism. I think there was one or two journalists who came out and said it's a little bit like Radiohead, and he sounds a bit, he's pretending to be Tom York. And I think the comparisons really, at the time I said to the boys, this is a compliment, because number one, Radiohead are a great band. You're being compared to one of the best bands around right now. And also Tom York's a great singer. And Matt, you're a fucking great singer too. So those comparisons are great.
I was actually quite surprised when the reviews came out and journalists, you know, were comparing them to Radiohead and, you know, just like dismissing them and saying, oh, they're just Radiohead copyists. And I thought it was quite sad, really.
Despite these comparisons, Muse were well on their way. From the beginning, they had always toured heavily, and on the back of their first album, Muse continued this, playing as many festivals around Europe as possible, and also venturing into Japan and the United States. However, it was something of a coup that Muse suddenly found themselves supporting two of the biggest names in American rock music at the time, the Red Hot Chili Peppers and the Foo Fighters.
When we finished Showbiz, you know, they did tours around the UK, but what Safta and Dennis did was put them out into Europe, you know, because they'd done deals with record companies, independent record companies in France and Germany and Scandinavia, and part of the deal of signing the band, licensing the record, was that they would provide tour support. What really changed them, I think, was going out to Europe, which would have been year 2000, I think, and they supported Red Hot Chili Peppers and Foo Fighters.
Well, the tour with the Red Hot Chili Peppers and the Foo Fighters came about after a show they played at the Bercy in Paris with both those bands. And they got on really well, and the bands were blown away by them, and I think they went out with Dave Grohl afterwards, who was a big hero of the band, obviously being Nirvana fans, and got hammered like for hours and hours in various places. So as a result of that, they landed the opening slot on this American tour that was about a month long.
I was amazed we got it. I mean, we really fought hard to get it. I mean, I remember a guy called Bruce Floor, who was the A&R guy for the Foo Fighters, calling me up and swearing down the phone saying, you know, I don't know how you got your band on this tour. He said, I couldn't get one of my own bands on, and Foo Fighters are my fucking band. But he said, you know, but it was a fantastic achievement to get that tour. But for the band, it was a great growing up process because, you know, here they were, you know, playing in America for the first time, playing in sheds in front of, you know, we're talking about 20,000 people on some shows. I think it was a real learning, growing up experience.
And they came back like really different people. You know, they were full of confidence, and you could tell that they'd been through a lot. They've kind of lost themselves, you know, they sort of stood naked. They'd lost everything, all their clothes and everything. And, you know, from that, they became strong as people, you know, and particularly in their playing, you know, when you saw them playing live and in the studio, it was much more stronger, more forward, you know, more confident, and the whole thing just went up a level.
As soon as they'd finished recording Showbiz, Matthew already had probably another 50 songs in his head. And, you know, you could tell at sound checks, you know, I used to sit in on sound checks because I always found it quite interesting because I'd hear a new tune. Because he'd be sitting there with his, you know, with his guitar in his hand, sort of just mumbling to himself and playing riffs, which, you know, always sounded great to me. So you know, we were encouraging them to road test songs on the road because, number one, you'd get an audience reaction to see how well that was going down, and number two, they were crafting that song at each show. So by the time we were ready to go in to do the second album, you know, I would say that most of that second album had already been written and road tested.
It was sort of the Showbiz period, but it was the later half of Showbiz because towards the end of the bit that I did, we started to go into doing. They were writing songs that became Origins of Symmetry. Some of the songs that were already around in the set became Origins of Symmetry. It got quite confusing though because for ages when they used to name songs, they used to name them things like New One and New One and New One. Like, you know, and if those songs had different tunings, it got quite confusing because, you know, you had to think, right, okay, which one are we on now? Is it New One or is it New One? Like, you know, like kind of. So that kind of got a bit confusing. So, I mean, I suppose, yeah, towards the end of Showbiz into the beginnings of Origins of Symmetry, and I believe, you know, we did some of the we took the gear into the studio to do some of the early demos for what became Origins of Symmetry.
But what we decided to do was to try and, you know, break out and put them in with a different producer, just to see what else would happen. So at the time, you know, a good friend of mine, a producer called Dave Bottrell, who's renowned for working with harder rock bands, you know, he'd worked with Tool. So we'd approached him, and you know, and he was already a good fan of the band and made a good connection with Matt. So we put him into Ridge Farm Studios here in Dorking, England, to record 4 of the key songs: Plug-in Baby, Newborn, Dark Shines, and Bliss.
What I was personally expecting was going to be a much more sort of concise sort of rock pop record, because I remember first hearing Plug-in Baby at one of the French shows, quite early on in the Showbiz tour, so soon after the album came out, and it was quite frustrating for me because everyone else had the thought of them as this sort of big bombastic prog band, really. And then there was this nugget song that I knew was there, and it made every Muse gig was utterly unmissable, and you had to go because Plug-in Baby was going to get played.
Waiting for the opening riff to Plug-in Baby because that's the point at which I really started loving Muse. The whole album as well has a kind of harder sound than Showbiz. It's got more of a kind of rock flavour about it, really. It's almost like they know that they're getting somewhere with their sound and they're almost like chomping at the bit. They want to do more. But there's obviously lots of interesting electronics there, and there's interesting uses of instruments like the mellotron, and there's these seeds of almost an interest in prog and psychedelia that you can kind of hear starting to come through, but it's a much more American-sounding record. It's a much more rock-sounding record than some of the others.
Plug-in Baby was the first taste from Muse's second album, Origin of Symmetry, and was issued in March of 2001. The song helped establish the band's harder rock credentials, as well as offering a more radio-friendly punch. It proved to be a big success, with the single charting just outside of the top 10 in the UK and became a firm fan favourite. Along with a progression in sound came an expansion in the lyrical content and subject matter of Muse's output. With shades of science fact and fiction creeping into songs on Showbiz, Origin of Symmetry began to develop these ideas further in such tracks like the opening song, Newborn.
Well, Newborn is an interesting track because, again, it's a track that kicks off the album, and it's a track that, again, is not necessarily what you'd expect an album to start off on. You know, I get the sense the Muse always want to go, we're not going to do the obvious thing. We're going to do something that's going to, you know, mess your mind a bit. There's something slightly mystical about Newborn. It's almost hypnotic, and it's driving, you know, bringing you in with its riff, and it's bringing you in with the strange sounds that it's creating.
Yeah, I think Newborn was one of the first songs that explored one of the more sort of crazy ideas that Matt was coming through. I think he got the idea from a book he was reading about the idea that creating robots was like a new sense of evolution, and that this was like the birth of a new sort of being, and that robots would eventually become as intelligent and as much of a living organism as we are, which I think is a fascinating idea, but the result of as many of his songs are, of Matt dipping into the odd book here and there and reading a chapter here and there and then sort of making up the rest, which I think is a fantastic way of working and made for a really interesting song.
I think the elements of bringing more piano into the songs was something again Matt had been doing live, so it wasn't too much of an alien thing for us, and it wasn't something that I remember consciously mentioning to any of the producers to do less of. But what was important was that they still wanted, they still very much were a rock band. So, and I don't think that the rock edge went away. I think if anything, the piano just added more melody, and it just gave the sound a lot more depth. So I don't think it really took away from anything of what they were. If anything, it added a lot more, and we were all for it.
After completing the sessions with Dave Bottram, which spawned 3 out of the 4 singles from Origin of Symmetry, the band returned to work with John Leckie, who was to produce the more experimental tracks on the album.
Each track probably had a different mood. Tracks like Screenager, which was, again, took to a totally different kind of angle with Dom playing lots of interesting percussion.
We wanted to get a kind of spooky, strange, kind of mysterious feel on it, and we didn't want to use regular drums, didn't want to use their usual instruments. And so a mate of mine had some old drum kit, an old rusty Ludwig drum kit, and resonant sort of snare and things, and I borrowed the old drum kit, and I used to have, there's South American shakers, and they're actually llama's toenails, and they're actually toenails from cattle all strung together on a string, and you put them around your wrists and shake. When you play guitar, in a lot of South American, they put these shakers around their wrists, and when they strum the guitar, you get the rhythm going with the shaker. And they loved this, and we were going to get some human bones, and I think we did get some animal bones from the butcher, and boiled them up and bleached them, and banged them together to create this sound, and just generally created a spooky sort of mysterious atmosphere.
Reminded me very much of that kind of Tom Waitsy, very kind of swampy kind of weirdness, and then other tracks like Megalomania, where we went out to a local church in Bath, and Matt recorded. We recorded Matt playing a massive pipe organ.
So with the track that became Megalomania. It always had, the demo, I think, or when Matt was playing it live, he'd have this organ, da-da-da-da, kind of fanfare thing. And he said, come on, we need a real church organ on this. We don't want to use just a keyboard, Let's find a good church organ. And so we jumped in the car, and as we're driving through Bath, he goes, stop, look, there's a church, stop. And he jumped out the car, ran into the church. I went off to park somewhere, and Dom and Chris are in the back. And as we walked into the church, opened the church door, there's Matt playing the organ. And he'd walked in, and the organist was playing, and he walked straight up to the guy and said, can I have a go? And the guy said, yeah, sure. And as me, Chris and Dom walked in, and there was Matt, with all the stops out playing this organ. He said, it's great, this is what we use. And so I had to talk to the vicar and, just arrange a fee. We gave him a few £100 for the, church fund, And about a week before we were due to go in to record this, the vicar had contacted me and wanted a copy of the lyrics of the song, of what the song was about. I hope you understand, he said. I said, oh yes, And so I said, Matt, you got to write these lyrics out for the vicar, or else we can't use the organ. And of course, Matt hadn't actually written the lyrics yet, so he scribbled out some positive, kind of nice love sort of lyrics, and I sent that off, and the vicar read them and said, "Oh yeah, that's okay. Very nice poetry, you know."
I think that entire album, Origin of Symmetry, invented a new sort of breed of prog rock. It's kind of a shame that it has to be linked to the idea of prog. I mean, the prog in the 70s was so dull and self-indulgent, and there wasn't really much rock to it. And Muse weren't really doing that. They were making longer songs. They were making songs that shifted between various sections, so they were clearly delineated sections of their songs. But they were still fairly tight. They were still noticeably rock or pop songs. They were showing real signs of being able to make not so much a new prog, but take the ideas and the ambitions of prog and put it into a modern rock context.
The final single from Origin of Symmetry was a double A-side featuring the blistering rock riffs of Hyper Music and Muse's own take on the 1965 Anthony Newley and Leslie Bricker's track Feeling Good. Although failing to top the heady success of earlier single releases, Feeling Good peaked at number 24 on the UK chart in November 2001 and proved to be another interesting and innovative turn from the Tinmouth Trio.
Feeling Good had been a song that they'd been playing out live, but were very reluctant to record, and so it took quite a bit of persuasion getting them to put that down onto tape.
Feeling Good was a kind of a throwback to Matt's upbringing and the classic records that he heard as a youth. And I think it really underpinned Origin of Symmetry. It was a great thing to have on there because in the middle of all of this sort of sprawling, ambitious sort of craziness was this familiar song done in an edgy sort of way, and certainly one that wasn't sort of doffing its cap to the original. It wasn't, you know, he sang one of the verses with a megaphone. So he was quite willing to mess around with it, to play around with the original.
Birds flying high, you know how I feel. Sun in the sky, you know how I feel. Reeds drifting on by, you know how I feel. It's a new dawn, it's a new day, it's a new life for me, and I'm feeling good.
That blew me away the first time I saw it. It blew me away, like, and it's the way, you know, the passion in the breakdown and just the way they do it. And I've now been out and I've seen smaller bands covering that song in Muse's style because they almost think it's a Muse song. like, you know, and yet, you know, it's a classic jazz song. So obviously, you know, they've influenced people drastically.
After we delivered Origin of Symmetry to the US, the band had already become a successful band here. I think we were gold here with Showbiz by the time we delivered Origin of Symmetry. And so in Maverick's head, there was still this young British band that they signed that hadn't really happened on the first album. Now, you got to remember, Maverick had spent a lot of money on the first album. Guy told me he'd spent over $1 million trying to break Muscle Museum at radio in America. So having spent that sort of time, money and energy into Showbiz, when we delivered Origin of Symmetry, I think Guy was looking for his pop hit. And when I told him Plug-in Baby would be his pop hit, he said, well, I like it, but it's too raw. It needs to be a lot poppier. And I thought, okay. So he said, can I do some mixes on it? I said, yeah, sure, have a go. So he did some mixes on it and played them back to us, and they were horrible. You know, he'd pretty much taken all the guts out of the records. And I said to him, look, you know, I appreciate what you're trying to do here, but this sound isn't the band. You know, you've taken out their sound and made them something they're not. The guy, you know, was very shy of it. Even to an extent that he decided not to put the record out. So he sat on the record in terms of not releasing it. And in many ways, that actually worked in our favour, because it allowed us to satisfy all the other territories. Because had Maverick gone after Origin of Symmetry, I think it would have been very difficult to have satisfied, you know, the work touring commitments that were now being put on us from around the world. So in many ways, it worked to our advantage.
Despite positive reviews and strong chart positioning worldwide, Maverick was still not content with Origin of Symmetry, and it would not see a US release until 2005. In the meantime, Muse forged ahead with a live album from the resulting world tour.
Matt realised that, you know, he had a real connection with the audiences, and because touring was such a big element of what the band, you know, did and what they stood for, you know, he wanted to take touring to the next level. And, you know, we'd come out of the clubs by now. You know, we were touring in our own right. We were doing our own shows. And, you know, so it was time to think about production. And he didn't want to do anything, you know, gimmicky or something that would cost the earth. So we were looking at other ideas. And at the time we got involved, we found this great lighting engineer called Ollie, who was introduced to us. And he had some fantastic ideas that were, you know, at the time sort of quite groundbreaking and suited the band and suited Matt's thinking. And it was also around the time that we were thinking, I wanted to capture the band's performances on tape. And so I had this idea of doing a live DVD.
The show was coming on brilliantly. I mean, on this tour they had the balls started coming out, the big white globes, which was really exciting. I mean, you'd go and see it. I mean, one time at a festival I actually helped sort of drag them out and throw them into the crowd, which was amazing, because you know what sort of joy it is once you start seeing them coming out. And they had that, and they had sort of these massive, great sort of white cylinders that sort of make all crazy colours. And Matt had amazing little touches, like in Feeling Good, he'd have some sort of glitter in his pocket and just sort of throw it as he sort of finished the piano bit, he'd just sort of throw it and let it fall to the ground. Real showmanship, and you could see that they were an arena band, you know, waiting to really crack that circuit.
The visuals and the light shows and everything is really important to me, because it helps enhance the importance and the reference points for the songs as well. You know, because if they're singing, they're fantastic songs, but if he's sitting there in a room with an acoustic guitar, it doesn't take you to that other place. You can hear the song, but actually live, it does for me anyway. It does take you onto other place.
And so we chose Paris as a venue to do it, because the French audiences at the time were the most enthusiastic. And the Zenith is a beautiful venue in Paris. And so we planned to do 2 nights at the Zenith, and we filmed both the nights. And we had 35 cameras that we had plotted all over the stage, everywhere. I mean, you name it, we had cameras everywhere. And, you know, we managed to capture that, you know, I believe we captured that energy on tape, you know, on Hullabaloo.
so I think Hullabaloo was important in getting them there, because it was showing there you are, this is a fantastic band, performing fantastically, going wild at the end, smashing everything up, and with this amazing show. I mean, it was kind of a showcase, really, for the rest of their career.
By the end of 2002, Muse were riding high, and going into the new year, they set about planning their third studio album, to be titled Absolution. Having achieved steady success with their previous two releases, the band wanted to progress further and discussed the idea of using a different producer to take them in new directions.
Going into Absolution, we had a meeting with the band, and Matt said to me, he said, we want to work with a younger guy. We want someone like John Leckie, but half his age. Oh, Christ, okay. I don't know who that guy is going to be. So I said, all right, well, let me see who I can think of. So again, I went back to Rick Rubin, because I thought, well, he's one of the greats. So I said to Rick, Rick, who's like the best new kid on the corner that you rate? And he looked at me and he said, well, you know, Rich mixes all my records, and just walked off. And I thought, Rich, who the fuck is Rich? Okay, so then I found out that Rich was this guy, Rich Costey.
I always wonder how Muse managed to go a step further every time, because they didn't start as a small, shy, sensitive band. Absolution, obviously, they brought in Rich Costey to produce it, who had, you know, background producing Rage Against the Machine, was involved with Audio Slave. So that suggests that he knows how to bring a kind of stronger, more fierce sound out of a band.
Rich was sort of trying to convince them to do the whole album with him, but they also wanted to do some massive orchestral songs on the record. So the first sessions they had were with Paul Reeve, who'd worked with him on Showbiz. And they hired in a massive orchestra, and they did about 5 songs. Apocalypse Please they did, and Butterflies and Hurricanes, and Blackout, and a few others. But they didn't really quite work out. So in the end, Rich Costey sort of came in and did pretty much the whole album, apart from 2 tracks. And I think with that album, they really nailed it. I think they nailed it properly as far as reining in the more extreme, sort of progressive sort of sprawls into digestible chunks.
You get the sense of the band were working very hard on their songs and their songcraft, and kind of tying up the ends of different things, and you know, trying to present something that was really beautiful but really striking at the same time.
Absolution featured a strong complement of different styles and sounds that would maintain the Muse ethos, yet also appeal to a broader audience. This was something that Safdar Jaffrey had been keeping in mind since the issues that had occurred with Maverick on the previous album.
Absolution's got a good mix of melody, harder edge, depth. I think it's got elements of everything that I think we were trying to achieve at the time. And also in the back of my mind, there was America. You got to remember, you know, Maverick had still been sitting on the record. And by the time we delivered Absolution, I'd managed to walk out of the deal with Maverick, because there was this clause in there that said that if they hadn't released it within a certain period of time, that we could walk out the deal. So we'd already served notice on Maverick. And I'd already made a decision that I wasn't going to shop another deal in America until I had the third album in my hands, because I didn't want to have the same experience again. Because I wanted to find a label that would believe in this record and you know, go after it. Also at that time, we decided that we were going to bring in American management, because America, you know, was the territory that we really needed to, you know, try and break, because that was the weak link now. You know, funny, you know, having been the strongest link at the beginning, that was now the weakest link. Q Prime had shown the most interest. Cliff Bernstein, you know, was particularly taken by the band. So the moment Q Prime had shown the interest to be the US management, it had become pretty clear that the deal was going to go to Warner Brothers.
Having agreed a deal with Warner Brothers in the US, Muse's British label, Mushroom, was also acquired by the American giant, making Absolution Muse's first major label release in the UK. In a bid to counteract Warner's aggressive marketing, it was decided that lead single, Stockholm Syndrome, should be released only over the internet, maintaining the band's indie roots.
With the Stockholm Syndrome release, you can see this is an example of Muse wanting to stretch the boundaries, not just musically, but also as technologically, as far as the industry is going. That was one of the first download-only singles, I think. They sold it for £1 from their website. There was no way of, at that point, of notching up how many it sold or putting it in a chart anywhere, but it would have made number 3, they reckon.
It was actually my idea to do Stockholm Syndrome as a internet download because it hadn't been done before. And actually, when I came up with the idea, I was surprised nobody had done it. I thought it was a no-brainer. So why don't we just put it on the bloody internet and let people download it? And everyone looked at me as if I was like some strange alien. And I thought, what have I said? But then everyone thought it was a good idea, and that's what we did. So that gave us the time to put out Stockholm Syndrome as an internet-only single, and then do Time Is Running Out as a proper single release, and then bring the album in. So that all worked quite well to plan.
Muse have always been obsessed with fear, paranoia, extreme states of emotion. You know, even in their early records, you can hear that kind of sense that they're drawn to these subjects. Absolution was the first album in which they properly started to engage with these ideas. Thinking back to 2003, when Absolution came out, there was this sense in society that, you know, what was going to happen with the world. You know, obviously, Matt has always been influenced by, you know, writers like George Orwell and people who've written, you know, quite apocalyptic or dystopian narratives. But back in 2003, you know, Britain was in a very strange place. The war had just broken out in Iraq. The popular protest seemed to finally people were saying popular protest isn't working, and 2 million people have marched against the war and nothing has changed. There was this sense in youth culture definitely that, you know, there's nothing we can do.
It was interesting the themes that, again, Matt was picking up on, because 9/11 and the Iraq War kind of turned his attention away from the string theory and the sort of space, sort of this strange planets full of like aliens that were coming and creating life on Earth, which was what he was talking about a lot on Origin Symmetry, to very sort of human, political things on Absolution. And Time Is Running Out was the poppist element of that.
Time Is Running Out is a song that always stands out for me. When the chorus bursts into life, you know, what's really great about them, you know, kind of saying things like time is running out, you know, kind of just such grand statements and terrifying statements, but they say it in a way that everyone can join in.
I mean, the video itself was showed a sort of some shadowy war cabinet sort of controlling the world, and a lot of the lyrics on the album were inspired by, he was looking into the Trilateral group and the Bilderberg group and people like that, and you know, these shadowy collections of people with power who are supposedly ruling the world.
Time Is Running Out proved to be a great success for Muse. Released in September 2003, it was the band's first US hit and also their first top 10 record in the UK, reaching number 9.
I think Time Is Running Out is one of their best pop songs. I think it was a very accessible gateway into the album. There's songs dotted all through Absolution that are kind of there to underpin the fact that they're a great tune band as well. And then Hysteria is one of them, and Thoughts of a Dying Atheist. You know, they pop out like every sort of 2 or 3 songs is just a classic, great, you know, rock pop song. And I think Hysteria is one of them. And then hilariously, as far as I'm aware, it's one of the only charting songs about the female orgasm.
I've always thought of them as a heavy band. So yeah, when they did Absolution, to me, that's as heavy as the other stuff. It's that mixture of kind of heavy metal with a choir boy's voice. You know, it's that mixture of my favourite things, you know, kind of, it's like Led Zeppelin with Alec Jones, isn't it? It's kind of mental, but it works.
The songs are quite adventurously written, you know, they're not formula written, you know, they're not written as pop songs, they're not aiming for the charts or anything. You know, they're really aimed at live performance, you know, they're aimed at exciting the audience, really.
It's quite tricky to capture a live performance when you know you haven't got the band at all in the video. But I think what we tried to do with the pictures, without sounding too wanky, was try and have a performance going on with this guy smashing up the room. So, you know, when he's chucking a chair through a mirror or when he's turning everything over, it's not that dissimilar to, you know, some of the moves that Matt does with his guitar.
That time that record came out, I mean, it was, you know, it's like a meteorite hitting rock, really. I mean, at the time, all the music that people were listening to were, you know, the Strokes had come through, and the Libertines were happening, and there was a real sort of a return to kind of fast and jangly, sort of tuneful, quick rock. Songs in under 2.5 minutes and played by sort of scruffy blokes, probably on drugs, quite cool. And this was something completely out of that world. I mean, this was, you know, it was super massive, for a better word. And the other sort of post Radiohead bands, such as Coldplay, for instance, had gone down a much more mainstream route. Coldplay actually very good friends with Muse. So yeah, I mean, they were far out. They were literally on their own planet at this point, and that in itself sort of laid the way for them to become a stadium act, really, and they really stood out so much that people started looking at them as festival headliners.
Muse finally got their calling when they were booked to headline the 2004 Glastonbury Festival. Although a daunting task for any act, it seemed as if Muse were simply coming home to a venue that was a more appropriate size for their music.
Well, I think a lot of people were surprised when Muse were announced as the headliners on the Friday night of that Glastonbury in 2004. Not because they weren't a good band. You know, I thought they were a very good band, but they still weren't quite at that point that they would be naturally picked to headline. But they really did pull it off, and they pulled it off in a way that people who weren't convinced by them previously were astonished by, you know, what they could do. You could sense that they'd been really working hard towards it. Matt looked fantastic. He's dressed in white, looking like, you know, some kind of prophet with spiky, crazy hair. And their sound works so brilliantly outdoors.
I saw it and it was absolutely incredible. It was a strange day, I mean, just as a punter, because everyone was, they were last thing on the Sunday night and everyone was sort of like, you know, Muse, headlining a festival, is that going to work? And having seen them a lot of times, I was just like, just go and see it and you'll see. And they just absolutely blew the place away. I mean, you've never seen anything like it.
Matt's kind of stage presence in the way he moves with the guitar and the, you know, the mirrored guitars and the lasers and it's all part of the show. So you kind of forget there's only 3 of them, possibly 4 of them, creating this amazing full-on sound.
People started really realising how special Muse were, largely because it's rare to find a band musically adept enough to make a record like Butterflies and Hurricanes. It's an incredible rock song, and then slap bang in the middle of it, there's, you know, you see it live and Matt sits down and suddenly he's a concert pianist, and it slaps you in the face. So where did that come from?
You can definitely hear the prog rock thing, can't you? I grew up on ELO, and that's probably why I love it. You know, OTT, the bigger the better, more strings, kind of, you know, that whole kind of breaking down into arpeggios, and, you know, one minute he's playing the guitar, then he's playing the piano. It's definitely very prog rock, isn't it?
After the euphoric highs of performing their first major headlining festival, the band were plunged into tragedy. When only an hour after Muse's set came to an end, Dom's father died suddenly backstage from a heart attack.
They were suddenly thrown into a period of unsurety about the future. They cancelled a show or two and they all went back to Devon and to be there for Dom. And Dom wasn't sure if he wanted to carry on in the band, and it was a tough time, and the band almost split up, but I think it brought them together more than anything. As a result of that, they realised what they had as a group.
But Muse were not finished yet. The overwhelming success of Absolution around the world had meant the band now had license to explore their potential even further, venturing into new sonic textures and expanding their themes and lyrical content. The following year, they returned to the studio and in July 2006 released the triumphant Black Holes and Revelations, which was to go on and become their most successful album to date.
They disembarked to a haunted chateau in France and sat there for 2 months with no contact with the outside world whatsoever, and talked about the apocalypse. Grew beards and got quite dark for 2 months. And they made a record there which they didn't really understand. It was sort of these massive, great jazz workouts that just seemed to sprawl over, and they couldn't get their heads around it. They'd just jam away, and they'd have these jazz side projects and play their songs as jazz bands, and it was an unformed mass of stuff they came out with, so that needed focusing, and then they ended up in New York, which saved the record and made it to the brilliant record it is today.
When the album was being promoted, I was desperate to get a copy of it. So we were sent the album on headphones that wrapped around the back of your head, and you had a little switch inside the headphones that you could play it on. Obviously futuristic, slightly weird, dystopian. I loved it. So I'd be sitting on a bus listening to this insane music. You know, it was, you'd be sitting on the back of a Routemaster's, I think that we still had then, listening to this heavy, strange sound, supermassive black hole. I remember hearing that and going, what is this?
Taking a song like Supermassive Black Holes, which they just simply didn't know what to do with in its form from the chateau in France, suddenly had this sort of funky sort of elements to it that they got from New York, and suddenly they had a brilliant fusion. It's just a song which has vocal experimentation all over it. I mean, the actual chorus which I'm not sure, I think Chris might even have sung, or certainly does live, of really distorted vocals. So I think it just comes across as a fun experimental pop track.
Supermassive Black Hole demonstrated Muse's willingness to expand upon their sound by mixing R&B rhythms, alternative guitar and electronica. As the lead single from Black Holes and Revelations, it also went on to be their highest charting release to date, reaching number 4 in the UK.
With Black Holes, they, as with Absolution, I think they sort of looked at what they'd done before and realised that what they were doing worked, and following their instincts and making stuff as big and pompous and wild and crazy as they can.
Black Holes and Revelations is like a big, fantastic space opera. That's what it is. It does take you on a journey, you know, like the best kind of concept albums do. I think it's very brave that Muse kind of almost brought back the idea of the concept album when it was possibly the naffest idea ever. It just showed that they didn't care. They're like, we can do this, and we don't care about what's cool and what's not cool. We're just going to do something.
Yeah, Black Holes was I agree with that, and I could, you know, you could see the whole thing performed as a musical, couldn't you? As a, not in a, I hate musicals, not in that nasty way, but in a kind of rock opera kind of aspect of it. Whenever you say things like that, it always still sounds a bit like prog rock opera. It always has this 70s kiss of death about it.
They really felt as though they could experiment here, and they really wanted to follow their instincts. So you do have electronica on the likes of Map de Problématique, and you've got this massive, great Night of Sidonia, sort of, you know, the most prog track they've done to date.
Nights of Sidonia, the title in itself, you know, what is that? Kind of, where is Sidonia? Nights, you know, kind of, nobody talks about nights anymore, you know, kind of in that sense. It's almost something, you know, very geeky about that title. I think people don't give Muse enough credit for their humour, actually. You know, they're always serious about what they do, they care a lot about it, but they know that in a lot of their songs there are a lot of things that will make you smile, will make you laugh and make you go, I can't believe they've done that, but they've done it and they've done it really well. Night of Sidonia being a great example, you know, that makes me laugh every time I hear it, not in a critical way. I think it's fantastic.
Any real successful band, you know, I think it's that mixture of, you know, having a laugh, but you know, playing the music and getting it right, honing the music, but with, you know, it's not a 9-to-5 job, you know, where you have to wear a shirt and tie.
In the video, you see the band in the video, they obviously are having a fantastic laugh in the video, and I don't think there's anything wrong with music that makes you smile and makes you laugh.
Nights of Sidonia video, I thought it kind of went to the one end of the spectrum that is at my least comfortable. You know, that kind of, I mean, it's rock pomposity into kind of quite over-the-top kind of gay cowboy vibe going on. And I think it worked, but it's not the kind of thing that I would make.
Matt was always saying, even from the early days, that he wanted to do a track that had a 15-minute guitar solo on it. And when they came up with that, I thought, well, this is it then. This is their big prog track. And to put it out, they put it out as the first single in America, and they started shows with it. And it was literally, this is what it is, take it or leave it, deal with this. And people absolutely adored it because of this massive, great sort of, it's the kick in after the No One's Going to Take Me Alive thing. Suddenly it was made to make festivals bounce.
2006, Muse were loved by certain people, and obviously they'd had commercial success, but Black Holes and Revelations was a massive breakthrough in terms of their international, status and reputation. Obviously gained them a foothold in America, and the next year they played in Wembley, in the 2 massive stadium gigs. It's funny that that is the record that made them accepted, almost as if people went, we can't believe that they keep building on their sound with each record, because the previous records are just as commercial, they're just as catchy, they're just as radio friendly. Black Holes and Revelations is almost a little less so in some ways, because it is heavy, because it is throwing these strange ideas about space and paranoia and, taking them to an even more intense place. But in some ways it's really fantastic that that is the album that took them there, almost that people started thinking, well, we do believe them now. We know that they really mean this, because they've, there's almost a thought that they can't take this further. This is brilliant. This is the apex of what they're going to do. But obviously we'd find out later that they would take their sound even further again.
The supporting tour in 2007 not only took in 2 sold-out nights at the new Wembley Stadium, but also multiple sold-out nights at stadia around the world. Having already wowed crowds with their previous shows, this proved to be one of their most ambitious, featuring a giant stage set, light show and acrobats. Keeping in tradition with their previous tours, the event was released as a live album and DVD the following year, known as the Harp Tour. Having played extensively throughout 2007 and most of 2008, Muse returned to the studio to record their 5th album, The Resistance. It was to be a record that would take the idea of their sound even further, and also would be the first album that the band would produce themselves.
Matt had been building this studio at his house in Italy for quite some time. They were supposed to do Black Holes and Revelations in it, but it wasn't ready in time. So this is the first album that they've made there. They also did some recording down in Devon, I believe. And they produced it. So it is very much the first, even though they've always been very hands-on with the production of their records, this is the first one that is completely their work.
I interviewed Muse back in the summer, and they were talking about how much they loved working with John Leckie. They were talking about how much they loved working with Rich Costey, but they'd got to a point in their career that they had to do something that shook them up a bit, that made them do something new. So they thought, I know what we'll do. We'll record an album ourselves, we'll produce it, and we'll try not to rein ourselves in. We'll just say, let's put in all this stuff, and if it works, fantastic. If it doesn't work, at least we've tried it.
And it's interesting what they've come out with, because it's since Origin of Symmetry, I think it's the first record of 2 halves, properly 2 halves, and 2 quite stark halves, in that you've got the real sort of big, epic, massive tune, well, not even tunes necessarily, but symphonies, if you like. There's a whole sort of symphonic sort of movement on it towards the end. The last 3 tracks are a whole chunk of a record. Compared to possibly what their most pop-sounding records, their most sort of polished, chart-worthy songs. So I'm not sure, to be honest, that it gels all that well. I think maybe it has come under some criticism, and I think maybe because those 2 sides of it jar a little bit, and it doesn't gel as well as the last 2 records have.
Transmissions will resume. I try to push, try to keep us all down and hope that we will never see the truth around. Another promise, another scene, another package like to keep us trapped in greed. A green belts wrapped around our minds, and
the other Muse albums, there are very obvious, straightforward anthems. On The Resistance, there aren't as much, but it's a record that takes time to grow and it takes time to develop. Uprising, obviously, is a very immediate track. It's got that fantastic Delia Derbyshire, Doctor Who feel about it, which I'm sure was very conscious, but it's got the fantastic screams at the end of the bars and lots of hooks that, are the mark of Muse's kind of talent. They've always been great at getting 3 or 4 fantastic hooks in a song that, will really grab you.
The Uprising, the track they put out as the single, is perhaps a little bit derivative. People have said that there's like 5 or 6 songs that it sounds like. It sounds like a Doctor Who theme tune. It sounds like sweet songs from the 70s. And, every time you listen to it, there's another song that jumps out that it can sound like. But I think I think maybe it's a record on which they're finding their own feet as far as actually being in complete control of a record.
Uprising was the first official single from The Resistance and performed solidly, giving the band their 4th UK Top 10 hit, as well as also achieving a surprisingly high entry on the US Billboard chart without receiving any airplay. The continuing themes of corrupt power and conspiracy throughout Muse's work were more than present on the album, and especially so on the track United States of Eurasia, which tells of an Orwellian future where all the countries have merged into one entity.
When I first heard United States of Eurasia, obviously, the title had been mooted before, and there's the obvious 1984 George Orwell kind of reference there. You knew that this was a band saying, right, we know that the doubters think we're obsessed with these ideas, but we're going to take them as far as we can possibly go with them. And I love it. It did make me laugh the first time I heard it because I thought it's so nakedly influenced by certain things, especially Queen, obviously. It's a 3-part song, and there's 2 3-part songs that are, stick in any pop fan's mind, which are Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody and Radiohead's Paranoid on Android, with which this shares, some kind of ideas, but almost like this is the 3rd great 3-piece pop song. The Queen influence, I asked Matt about this when I interviewed the band recently for the NME, and I said, I straight away I had this vision of Freddie Mercury, singing, with his ridiculous hair, and I could imagine your video, you're all against a black, background. And I said, did this come to you? Did this strike you as well? And he said, of course it struck me, as soon as we wrote that bit. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if we multi-tracked this vocal? And he said every time the band played that back, they just burst out into laughter because it was, obviously holds such an echo of, one of the best-known songs, that's ever come from Britain.
But soon we will see there could be only one United States. United States of
I don't like thinking of any of their songs as Queen tracks, because I think Queen are kind of the side of bombast that I think they should steer quite well clear of. When it becomes just too theatrical and too flamboyant and just a bit crass, I think. But still, I think a great pop tune at the heart of it.
Sounds really good.
Mm. Yeah, it's come different to what I expected it a little bit. It's much more,
Really?
it's much more interesting than what it first appeared. I mean,
It's got.
no, when I say first appear, you hear the opening line, you think, oh, here we go. Do you know what I mean? You think, oh, that's a boring ballad, isn't it?
Yeah.
It just goes completely away from there, doesn't it? It's almost like the front's almost like a deception of what actually takes place.
Well, it's been interesting the movement on in the themes that Matt's writing about, because on Absolution he started writing about the sort of the control that we're under and the paranoia and the conspiracy theories, but he wasn't really sure, what to rail against. He kind of felt a bit lost in it because it was a kind of immediate reaction to the Iraq War and 9/11, which the record was kind of underway when this was happening. So he was kind of trying to fathom out what was going on, and then on Black Holes, he'd kind of come to a few conclusions, and he was almost sort of, there were bits of it that sounded revolutionary, and he was finding a voice as far as encouraging people to tear the government down and start something new. And this record is even more in that vein, I think. I mean, this is really sort of railing against thought police, and it seems like he's really trying to make a change and trying to get to people on this record. I mean, you could say that because it's the third record with those sort of themes on it, that maybe he's sort of changed the record a bit. We know that you think that we're under control and we should be worried about it. But I don't know. I think it's an overtly political record, and possibly now he's more sort of confident in what he's saying about these things. It's one with a greater impact, and particularly now that they've got such a big fan base in America, it could they're in a position where they could really change things, and they could really change the way people think about things.
With the success they have achieved in America, Muse's reach finally spans the globe, and the release of The Resistance has demonstrated their desire to constantly push boundaries and explore more ways in which to make their music, something that has made them stand out from other acts.
They've got their own little genre, really, haven't they? And I think people will, if a band comes up that sounds like Muse, they'll say, oh, they sound like Muse, because they've got, a singer with a great voice, or a great axeman, or, wonderful arrangements.
Someone told me yesterday they were #1 in 16 countries this week with the new album, and that's great. Not many other bands can do that. You've got your Radioheads and your U2s, obviously, and things like that. But they've never come across as gone too commercial. I don't know. They still seem almost like a kind of a bit of an alternative band.
I always believed Muse could be the best band in the world, and I still believe that. I think they will go on to be one of the biggest bands ever. I think they will, be remembered as one of the greats. And I believe that at the beginning, and I believe that today.
It's hard to think what Muse are going to do next. You almost want them to go and live on Jupiter and play a gig to, 30 trillion people or something like that. That's the only way they could ever reach the summit of their ambitions, I think. But I think, talking in more practical terms, they will look at the orchestral side of their music a bit more. They will try and look, as they always have, around the world for different musical influences and bring them into their music.
They're still completely unique. I mean, they show that if you're doing something completely different, if you take, as they did, hard rock music and classical music and make them work together, then you're going to be world beaters. I think it's utterly inspirational and easily the best rock band in the world today.
The Resistance marks Muse's 5th album in 10 years, and in that time they have progressed from being an unknown local act to being one of the biggest bands in the world with a global fan base and universal ambition. Whether they are singing about dystopian futures, alien invasions, deep burning passions, or butterflies and hurricanes, the three friends will continue to shower the planet with their unique brand of exciting, cerebral, and provoking music.